Hi, Ruskin. Hello, good evening to our listeners on 91.1 FM, and special greeting to our colleague there, Ruskin Mark. Good evening to you. And special greeting to our listeners and viewers on social media, that is particularly on Facebook and YouTube. This evening, we have an interesting and packed program for you. This year is the 55th anniversary of the Black Power Revolution that took place in 1970 but had its beginnings in 1969. That is the Trinidad and Tobago arm of the Black Power Revolution, which was, of course, a Caribbean wide revolution. So we are going to be discussing that with two stalwarts of the revolution, exactly 55 years ago. We are also going to have a discussion on an ongoing situation in the United States of America, and we are going to be discussing that with a special guest who is resident in the United States and is directly affected by the policies of the present president of the United States. Now, the 1960s was indeed, to me, the most revolutionary decade since what I call a permanent bridging of the continents washed by the Atlantic Ocean 500 years ago. Now, these revolutions would have been a spillover from the late 1950s when we saw multiple simultaneous and revolutionary movements, including some of the following, which I would highlight in just in capsule form: the rapid collapse of many empires and the birth of new nations, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean. We saw new technologies in mass communication, and particularly the availability and access of television, the exploration of space, which became the new frontier for humanity. And relevant to our discussion this evening, there was a new unprecedented revolutionizing of women's rights. And this was supported by a new feminist historiography, which focused on new insights into the role of women in historical struggles, including their historical contributions to the destruction of chattel slavery in the Caribbean and on the American continent, and of course, shattering the glass ceiling in so many spheres of human endeavor. We saw the Cuban Revolution take off as a socialist revolution in the 1960s. That revolution, of course, was born in 1959, but the takeoff into a socialist mode began in 1960 in a definite way. And in South Africa, we saw a new commitment to armed struggle against the apartheid regime. And that decision saw the birth of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which today is the main opposition party in South Africa. That is the name of the party. We saw in the United States a new determination to end Jim Crowism in multiple attacks by civil rights revolutionaries. And one of the songs that perhaps ushered in that intense moment. There were many of them, but I particularly remember Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." And we are still pursuing that change. That mood is still with us even today. We have not completed the revolution. Against this whirlwind of change, young people in the Caribbean decided to become the agency of the destiny that they had hoped independence would deliver, and of course, did not. Among them were many women, and young girls as well. Some of them teens, many of them at school, and perhaps even younger. We have this evening our two guests. Renee, could you bring up our guests, please? Okay, let me go to my bio here. Yes, we have two guests with us. Welcome to the show. They are not newcomers, so I want to say welcome back to Indaba, the program where knowledge grows. We have with us Dr. Olabisi Kuboni and Dr. Asha Kambon, who was last with us quite recently. Dr. Kuboni is a retired senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, where she spent perhaps all of her adult life. And she was in the School of Education, that's her area of specialization. During the 1970s and 80s, she was at the forefront of the movement for social and political change, and of course became involved in the National Joint Action Committee, NJAC. And she continued to play a key role in social change for several decades. I'm not sure what she's doing now, if she's finally retired, but I know she's been active for many, many years. Dr. Kambon is a social activist who has extensive experience in conducting socioeconomic and demographic research. I think she really does not need an introduction, but Dr. Kambon received her doctorate at the UWI in social policy, and she has been founding director of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. I don't think she was in Trinidad at the time, but she was at the forefront of the civil rights movement and the Black Power revolution in the United States as well, because the name Black Power for our revolution is a take from the revolution in the United States. Of course, the word being coined by our own citizen, who was then known as Stokely Carmichael and later became Kwame Ture, and that's the name we want to remember him by. So, without further ado, I want to begin the discussion by a softball. I'm bowling a softball to start the discussion. Where were you two in 1969, 1970? And how did you first get involved in what became the Black Power Revolution? Because at the beginning, I'm not sure anybody knew it would have transformed into a full-blooded revolution. So where were you, and what was the role of the NJAC in the emergence and development and the progress of the Black Power Revolution? Yes, who would like to begin? Let us begin with Dr. Kuboni, because Dr. Kambon, as you know, is a regular feature on this program. So, Dr. Kuboni.
All right, like the, for the newcomer.
Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Your first question, the first part of your question is an interesting one, because you started off by saying that Sister Ash was not in Trinidad. And for the record, I was not in Trinidad either. So that is where I start. Not really. My introduction to the Black Power movement came when I was a student at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. I was there between 1966 and 69, and a lot of things were going on between 66 and 69 at the Mona campus of the UWI. A lot of us got our initiation into the new thinking about ourselves as Black people by being students on the campus at that time. It was the time when Walter Rodney had just become a lecturer during that time in history department, I think. And he gave lectures at various times on campus, as well as in communities all over Kingston and in other parts of Jamaica. So my orientation to Blackness, to Black Power, began at that stage in UWI. I was thinking today, if I could find a photograph of myself that somebody I don't know took in my red gown on the day when we went into Kingston to protest the government saying that Walter Rodney could not re-enter into Jamaica, coming back from a writers' conference in Barbados. So I was there that day, making our voices heard among thousands of students in that occasion. So that was my beginning of my orientation to the Black Power movement. Your next question about NJAC, I know that, and we cannot deny that the work of the movement in the United States influenced what was happening here in Trinidad and Tobago. Having said that, I would like to think that there was a lot that we developed in Trinidad and Tobago, to shape the Black Power movement in response to our needs and our situation. So as an offset, I would just like to throw that out, that yes, there was the influence of the United States, but we in Trinidad and Tobago, by 1969, I was back in Trinidad and Tobago. We in Trinidad and Tobago did a lot to shape the movement in our own image and likeness, if you want to use that term. So I will stop there for now.
Thank you. Dr. Kambon?
Ah, boy. I love when there's some overlap in a sense. I too became involved in the Black Power movement in 1966. And at least that's my awareness. I mean, I was involved and aware of the civil rights struggle because I was at university in North America. But in 66, our brother Kwame Ture was down in, I think it was Mississippi. Yes, he was in Mississippi. And he shouted Black Power when everybody else at the time was saying, we shall overcome. So it was like a bolt of electricity, I suppose, that not just hit me alone, it hit many people across the world. I did not get back home until very early 71, I think. But between 66 and 68, 69, interestingly, I found myself deeply engrossed in what was happening at home. And interestingly, Walter Rodney at that time was at the center of that, because I remember we had these all-night parties, as though the one thing I remember is that we had these all-night parties waiting for Walter. Because, and let me say that we were waiting for Walter because he was coming back either from one of those Canadian Black Writers Conferences where he spoke, or he was coming through from the Caribbean where hell was breaking loose. And lastly, he was headed off to Tanzania. And so lots of us were organized around what was happening at home. And actually, a few of us, including my good brother Tracy Wilson, who's transitioned before me, we formed an organization called the Afro-Caribbean Students Movement, because we felt, what shall I say, we agreed with our brothers and sisters in Trinidad and Tobago and in the region that we're saying West Indies has to go. The phrase has just got to leave us. It's time for the Caribbean to take its rightful position. So we formed an organization called the African Caribbean Students Movement, and we, rallied around that. I Yeah, I'd like to also add that I feel that the movement in Trinidad and Tobago, I mark it starting in 66 and developing around there. And I see it's the Black Power revolution coming really to an end. And I don't know how Ola feels about that, but I feel we can mark that in 1983 at the murder of Maurice. The ball just dropped, and but we could talk about that. But
Tell
so
us a
I,
little bit about 1966. You have shifted the beginning from 69 to 66. Tell us a little bit for the justification for 66.
yeah, 66, because, well, not just that that Kwame shouted Black Power, but that that changed the way in which people were going to organize against oppression, and then we had, when you look at what was happening in Trinidad as well, and what was happening in Jamaica, all this huge outburst in support of Walter's denial of re-entry into Jamaica, and we were very much involved in that. Also, we were involved in marching against the Brits when they invaded Little Anguilla. It was Anguilla, yes. And that was around, that was, what year was that? I think that was in 60, somewhere there, 67, probably 68. And it was interesting that we had this, there was a brother who also has made his transition, but he was from St. Vincent. And he had this wonderful slogan, and he had us all marching up and down in front of the British embassy in North America at the time, in New York, saying, "Britain is a," and we would all respond, "Mother," and he would say very politely, "Country." So we had this amazing demonstration of all these Caribbean students protesting against the invasion of Little Anguilla by the Brits, when in fact they were ignoring what was happening in South Africa and at the time. So yes, so the things were parallel. We were all engaged, and we were keeping abreast of what was happening at home. So I
Yeah,
pushed back,
okay.
to 66.
Yes, okay. So you mentioned Walter Rodney, and of course, Walter Rodney is always mentioned uh, in terms of his influence in conscientizing his students and the public, in Jamaica particularly, elsewhere as well, but particularly in Jamaica in 1960s. But since we are focusing on women, I want to ask you, which women personalities had a major impact in transforming your own consciousness? Was Lucille Mathurin Mayer in Jamaica? I believe she was in Jamaica at the time, and she had already become revolutionary in her thinking. What about women elsewhere? Were there particular women you would like to highlight as your role models and influencers in your own participation in the Black Power Revolution?
I don't know if I could. Yes, I know the name Lucille Meir. She was, I think she was the hall leader of Mary Seapool Hall or something like that at the time, but she was on campus. But to me, when I think of a lot of individual women come to mind, but in terms of the Caribbean, and I'm sorry I don't have that book in front of me right now, but Nani, the leader of the Maroon people, I think my reading of that book inspired me a whole lot. Her work, in struggle, and as a leader of the Maroon people in Jamaica, I found that, her work was very inspiring to me, as someone who was trying to locate themselves in a situation where there was, where our people was trying to lift ourselves and to come to terms with the oppression that we were undergoing, and trying to define a road to get our independence, to get control of our lives. And to me, if I would single out anybody, not somebody who was a contemporary of my time, but if I would single out anybody, Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica comes, clearly to mind. In terms of other women, though, at people who have not been written as much as Nanny was in the Caribbean, I will come back home. I will come back home to people. Asha said we haven't written enough about them, but older women at the time, like Sister Rosetta Adams in Trinidad and Tobago, and Mother Inez. My mind is good. I didn't know I was going to be able to do that. These women who came out of an earlier period of struggle in Trinidad and Tobago, out of the Butler movement, and who just threw themselves into the struggle of the 70s, 69, 70s, and were beacons of inspiration to us younger ones in the struggle. So those people who were there on the front line, who did a lot of sacrifice in their own lives, and took a lot of blows for what they were doing. Those women, Sister Rosetta Adams and Sister Inez, those two, if I think a little bit more will come to mind. But in terms of people locally here, they really were inspiration to us younger ones. And from a previous generation in the Caribbean, Nanny of the Maroons.
Yeah, let's hear Dr. Kambon before I bring in Shabaka. Your response. I'm wondering if Claudia Jones had any impact at all, being a Trinidadian as well. And this month is her birth month. Mm-hmm. Very important year for her. Yes, Dr. Kambon?
Yeah, unfortunately, Claudia Jones' name did not come into my consciousness until much later. But definitely, I absolutely reinforce and support Ola's listing of people like Rosetta and Mother Inez. They were absolutely fearless. I mean, we have not even, that's why I say we've got to write Rosetta and her husband. What a pair! I mean, incomparable pair. And in terms of my own, as well, outside of Trinidad and Tobago, it would have been people like Kathleen Cleaver and Angela Davis. I was mesmerized by the two of them. Just completely defiant, completely knowledgeable, well-read, well-studied, defiant, and willing to put their life on the line. And just as I suppose, just as I was probably getting more and more deeply involved and more knowledgeable, I mean, Angela found herself in trouble supporting those Jackson brothers who were in San Quentin, I think it was. And, it was just one of those moments when you recognize that, in fact, if change is going to happen, if we're really about transformation, then in fact, we have to be prepared to make those kinds of sacrifices that are necessary for change to come. And so outside of Trinidad and Tobago, those two women, and inside, definitely Sister Rosetta and Mother Inez. And then there was the very elderly woman who we came upon many years later, Daisy Creek Nelson. And she was a Butlerite. And she was an amazing old elder. I mean, still in the fighting mode and in the fighting spirit. So yes, there were women that some we uncovered, some who were right in front of us and working, stepping ahead of us. Yeah.
That's Shabaka, brother.
Greetings, let me say a special good night to Auntie Olabisi and Mama Asha. These are the kinds of, this kind of language we would have used in the 1970s when, the idea of family went beyond the blood relatives to a wider revolutionary family, those who were committed to struggle. Now, tonight, part of our responsibility as hosts is to ask about the role of leadership in the 1970 Black Power Revolution. I want to pose the question this way. A lot of the young students that I've encountered along the way, writing not just about 1970 in particular, but about the 60s in general, women in particular, writing on women in that period, tend to write about the way that they were marginalized in the movement. So I'd like you guys to speak to that. What was the role of women in the 1970 Black Power movement? And both of you guys, of course, were participants, and you all could speak to the degree to which such was the case, whether there was a degree of marginalization or whether 1970 saw an advance in terms of women in leadership positions. If that was part of the thinking of the revolution, consciousness of the struggle at the time.
The issue, I'm trying to get my head around, you spoke of women in particular talking about being marginalized during the 1970s. Is that the issue that you're raising?
I'm raising the issue that I've encountered a number of students who are doing their master's degrees, their first degree perhaps, their PhD, and from what they have told me, their work is centered around the way women were marginalized in the civil rights movement and in the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago. I've had one or two students specifically speak about the Black Power Revolution. And they're work in that area. So what I'm trying to find out from you now too, as both veterans of the movement of the 70s, what was the role of women? Did they play an active part in leadership, or did they reflect some kind of traditional gender relations that was so problematic in the 20th century?
The word marginalized is
Hold on, we're having a sound problem. Shabaka, that might be coming from you, so mute your mic. Go ahead, Dr. Ola. Go ahead, Ola.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's better. The word marginalized is interesting to me. What I will say, though, is that the experience, in one sense, the experiences of men and women taking part in the struggle more or less, in some instances, not all overlapped, but there were instances in which the experience of being a woman in the struggle would be different from that of a man. At the same time, I would say that wanting to bring change in your own life and wanting to be a part of a movement for change in the society as a whole comes with certain pain. Because change always has a certain amount of discomfort and pain and that kind of thing. So it depends on one's willingness to continue to understand what one is involved in, what the change is all about, how one feels that the change is justified, and how one feels that one wants to continue to participate in this change that happens both at a personal level as well as the broader societal level, and where there would be a lot of conflict and tension involved in participating in that change process. And you make your decision based on that, how much one is going to be involved in it, if one is going to go by the wayside. But to say that there was marginalization, that is a strange word for me.
Right. I would also agree with Ola in that. I would say that, you know, that women and men played, yes, different but equal roles in the movement. And as Ola says, women and men played as much of a role as they were prepared to play. Some were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. And that ultimate sacrifice for that person was different from the ultimate sacrifice for someone else, you know? And so, but to say that the structures of the movement marginalized men or women, either group, I think would definitely not be accurate. Why could I say that with such a definitive sense? Because I think of the way we were engaged in change and the way we were engaged in both developing institutions for change and the way we were engaged in active. I remember just an example of myself. When I came back home, and I mentioned I was away, and that when I came in, there was a huge strike. The Dunlop workers were on strike. And I think because I had a reputation of being articulate and having been, because in the movement in North America, I was maybe sent in front of the Afro-Caribbean student movement that I mentioned. When I came back home, nobody thought twice what to do with me. I mean, I was sent down to Dunlop to join that picket line and provide some education sessions down there. I was told my assignment, I mean, I literally was home 2 weeks. I don't think I'd unpacked. And I was said, listen, down there, the brothers and sisters need some serious knowledge and education around issues of African history, Black power, what the society must look like. What are we talking about? Transformation, etc., etc. You go. And I said, yes. And I went down to Dunlop with a small bag thrown over my shoulder, and I was on the picket line. I was organizing rap sessions, teach-ins, you name it. I did that for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 weeks straight before I came up for air and said, hey, you know, what else? What else do I need to do here? You know, that was how the movement worked in those days. And we all shared in the work. You know, we all shared in the work. And you know, there was a big part of the process was collective work and responsibility. I think that is something that I can't get over. I am addicted to collective work and responsibility in the sense that I was taught that in the movement. It's the way the movement worked. It's the way I feel things should and ought to work. I'm convinced of that. I feel if people are given a chance to participate fully in what they think ought to be done, then they work towards that and they take responsibility for its outcome, because that is, you know, the way in which the ethos of the movement was. You engaged as much as you could. You took responsibility for your engagement, be you male or female, and you took responsibility for the outcomes. And I'm sort of I jump into organization. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, both of you, in different ways, became sort of icons post 1970s of the kind of empowerment that the women's rights movement was trying to engender. And I know your history very well, Mama. I mean, you become quite an activist in terms of women's rights. Did was the 1970 revolution of preparation? Did it also engender that consciousness? Did it, or was it just a preparation ground for you to be able to access consciousness, and then to be able to sort of become an important figure in the women's rights movement thereafter? Or was it part of the intrinsic consciousness of the movement that contributed to your participation in the women's rights movement after. And I say this knowing very well that a lot of women were involved in the struggle in the 60s in the United States as well, in the civil rights movement, then became leaders in the struggle for women's rights in the in the period thereafter as well. So there's my question.
Um, I would say that because the movement, the Black Power movement, your human rights, your rights your dignity as a human being, and the fullness of that, meaning your right to expression, your right to education, your right to a good quality of life, your right to be able to speak your truth, you know, that was such a fundamental part of it that I suppose by the time in 1983 and thereabouts that that the Black Power Revolution collapsed at the murder of Maurice, a lot of women and men, I suppose, who were involved in the Black Power movement found other entry points to continue that struggle for human dignity, for your rights, for your ability to speak your truth, and so on. And to me, that's, you did have, at least in the Caribbean, that movement shift into other spaces, and the women's movement in one of those spaces.
Dr. Kuboni, I mean, having spent all this time in academia, I mean, perhaps you would look back with a certain kind of, take a bird's eye view to answer this question.
I think, and some of our sisters in the women's movement for women's rights, sort of look scathingly sometimes at those of us
Yes.
in the in NCHAC, in the Black Power movement, right? And that is a thing to acknowledge. I think that I wouldn't say a separation, but not a total harmonization between working as centering yourself in the Black Power movement in an organization like NJAC as a woman, and working towards, women's rights. For one thing, I was trying to, as you were talking, Brother Shabaka, I was trying to go back into myself to see if at any point in my life, whether when I was in NJAC full-time or subsequently, whether I really considered myself somewhat, but whether I was fully involved in a women's rights movement, if I'm making sense there. You see, because within the Black Power movement, yes, you recognize yourself as woman, but it was woman in the context of reshaping and rebuilding a whole society, right? And there was a role that you had within that rebuilding and reshaping and fighting for change in the society as a woman that in a sense was not totally shared by the men in the organization. But at the same time, you were working towards rebuilding, reforming and transforming the society for all of the people in the society. And so there was, to me, a little bit of a difference between being a part of a woman's movement in and of itself and being part of a women's movement within NJAC. Now, when I moved away from and from being completely taken up with NJAT, I found myself in other things, not necessarily part of the women's movement. There was the whole business of constitution reform, which to me also spoke to the issue of what are we doing about the society. And there is and continues to be my own professional involvement in terms of education, that I still try to make statements about education. Now, so that has been, my experience, and that is my answer to your question about being part of the movement.
May I just add one thing, if I may? I would say that, as Sister Ola says, there was some unease between people looking in on us and so on. And one of the things I think in thinking about it, one of the ideas I came upon is that there was a point in the women's movement where there was not, okay, now in the women's movement, we talk about intersectionality, where you can respect the fact that women are not just women. They're not a homogenous something. There is race, there's ethnicity, there's religion, there's this, there's that, there's the other. And in the early days of the women's movement, there was no recognition, or very little recognition, of issues of race and ethnicity. So those of us who spoke to issues of race and ethnicity were kind of looked at rather strange, because the identity politics then was not supposed to be part of the women's movement. Now I think, now that there's this recognition that the intersectionality brings into play the fact that a woman is a woman and yet she's an African woman and can be oppressed because of that, or she is East Indian and can be oppressed because of that, or whatever. So you have
I hear you there, because what I was going to point out is that the 20th century was a century characterized more by discord among movements on the left than cooperation. And so you had the three major movements on the left: the workers' movement, seeing the women's rights movement and the struggle for racial justice as dividing the working class, and the struggle for racial justice having its own issues with the workers' movement, and the women's movement, and the women's movement having their own issues with all. But what was unique about Trinidad in this context, in my own research, and I think you all have already pointed to it, is that you had the Rosetta Adamses, you had the Sister Irene's, you go back to that sister from Grenada, what's her name, in the early 20th century? What's her name? He just slipped me for a minute. But what we find in Trinidad is that the leader of any one movement on the left was the leader of all the movements of the left. And so if you go back, I think the most famous example is that sister who was Elma Francois. Elma Francois was organizing the trade union movement. She was dealing with workers. She was organizing emancipation celebrations for racial justice. And she was also one of the leading pioneers of the women's movement. And I think that tradition continues right up into the to Auntie Rosetta, Sister Irene's, and others like that. That tradition of just working for social justice across the board. Whereas outside of the Caribbean, you have in the United States and Europe, these things, there was a lot more discord between these various tendencies. But I think we're coming down to the end of this segment, so I have to ask, what would be the role, I think the question is, the role of women from the revolution in the struggle today? What is it? And I think Sister Olabisi, Dr. Olabisi, has already pointed to the fact that she feels strongly about education and continuing to play a role in the movement for constitutional reform. So she's already answering that question in a way that the work continues. Perhaps you would want to add something to that.
Yes, definitely the work continues. And to find some of those women who were involved in the revolution at that time are still involved in issues for social justice. I think you would find a lot of them still. I mean, Sister Aintu spent her whole life since the revolution engaged in issues of social justice, and there are many more whose names I can recall. Our good sister, the Merle Hodge, who went to Grenada and participated in the Grenada Revolution. She continued to struggle for social justice, and my brain is not working to be.
And there are many others. We can call many other names. We can call many other names. From the young people like Jason Menard, who continues to be a progressive voice, and others, and so on. So the work continues. Anybody, in closing now, we remember 1970 for the benefit of our listeners as a movement that also sought to give form and substance to our independence, that struggled for racial justice as its at the core, but also to give form and substance to our independence. Would you like to leave the listeners, Dr. Kuboni, you first, with anything else that you would like them to remember when you think of 1970?
I would think of it, as a very important movement, an important movement with where people were moving with one voice, and there was it didn't work out. We could talk about that at another time, but the movement of people to save the society, I think, was an important factor of 1970, and certainly meant a lot to me.
Dr. Kambon, your closing remarks, and we have to say goodnight.
Okay, but I want to add that one of the things about 1970, and you have to close off your mic, Shabaka. Yes, one of the important, significant things about it are the institutions that it built. So that now, to me, when I come upon all these young people with their names, their African names, and they can say they are African, of African descent, or they are African, that is a contribution of 1970 and the work thereafter, the ongoing work. The still, I think, Sister Olabisi and others, Sister Abenkina, who worked with Ola in those days and so on, and other sisters like Fayola and Njeri, and the names I can just now coming to my head, who worked on the education of young people, who said, listen, young people we can transform that education, the way in which they receive knowledge and the knowledge that we share with them, and some of the little books that we produced and so on for those children at the time. I think that some of that is endured. That has endured. We are still working to give our children a different quality of education so that they too can feel they can transform themselves and the society.
Well, sisters, on that note, I want to thank you both for your contribution, not just to the society, but to those of us young people who went to revolutionary school in the 1970s. I personally learned, I was a student of Dr. Kuboni, of her French class at some point. And of course, in that revolutionary school, A was not for Apple, it was for Africa, and R was for revolution. Thank you very much, guys. Lots of love. Thanks for being with us here on Indaba.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And now Dr. Fergus, we turn our attention to the Caribbean students and challenges they are facing from a new executive order a few weeks ago by the new U.S. President Donald Trump, which threatens to deport those who are involved in what is termed anti-jihadist protests. And welcome, Brother Amandla. You are one of those potentially facing this kind of challenge. Let's start at the beginning. before we get into the latest situation that you're in, let's go back to your suspension for participating in a college protest against genocide, where as I recall, you and a number of other students went to a space where companies, I think it was a career fair where companies were involved in, companies who were supporting or working with the Israeli government that were on a list to be the BDS list. You all went to protest these companies and found yourself in a sticky situation. Let's start there, brother.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for having me on Indaba. It's great to see you, Shabaka, Dr. Fergus as well. Thank you. So firstly, on September the 18th, I took part in a protest at a job fair at Cornell University. There were a number of armed companies, including Boeing and L3 Harris. Now, these companies supply Israel with the jets, the bombs, sort of spare parts it's needed to carry out its genocide in Gaza against the Palestinian people. More than 40,000 people have died, recorded deaths, and counting, many more injured. So the career fair took place, we brought it to a standstill, and shortly afterwards, the university started to suspend students who took part in the career fair. Now, in total, they suspended 17 students, but I should add that there have been many actions at Cornell University. We've occupied the president's office, there was an encampment at the university, there were all sorts of actions, but it was at this particular moment the university went forward and suspended all of these students. Now, for some of us who are international students, this places us in a tricky position, given recent pronouncement by Donald Trump, who has vowed to deport students who were basically embroiled in these protests. So there are about 6 of us out of the 17 who are international students and are now at risk, basically, of deportation.
Sorry, Amanda, let me quote the international order here from the President of the United States of America. The fact sheet from the White House accompanying the executive order. Trump threatened to deport non-citizen college students and other international visitors who take part in pro-Palestinian protests. Trump said, and I quote, "To all the resident aliens who joined the pro-jihadist protests, we put you on notice. Come 2025, we will find you and we will deport you. I will also quickly cancel the student visas of all Hamas sympathizers on college campuses, which have been infested with radicalism like never before." The executive order promises to, quote, marshal all federal resources to combat what it called the explosion of anti-Semitism on our campuses and streets, unquote, since October 7, 2023. It called on the Secretary of Education to provide an inventory and analysis of all court cases involving anti-Semitism at campuses, universities, and K-12 schools within 60 days. The order requires colleges and universities to, quote, monitor for and report activities by alien students and staff that could be considered anti-Semitic or supportive of terrorism, potentially leading to their deportation. I need you to comment on that, Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, you can see here that the language is wildly exaggerated. We know that at the moment, the US is going through a period of consolidation in the executive order. Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights leader, gave a talk at my university the other week, and she called this is fascism, basically, right? That Trump is basically passing executive orders and effectively breaking the law, and then afterwards having to defend himself in front of judges to sort of, try and back what he's doing up. So this talk about anti-Semitism, this talk about pro-jihadist talks, this is a language that is designed to prevent any legitimate discussion of what the Israeli state has been doing to the Palestinian people for the last 75 plus years. We've seen this time and time again across the world, in the UK and in the US, that this charge of anti-Semitism is used to shut down debate, shut down legitimate debate, for us to question what a nation state is doing in a sort of environment which is really one of sort of colonialism. One of the inspirations for my activism when it comes to Palestine is Kwame Ture, who I know is a friend of, has been a friend of NJAC. And one thing that he said about how he sort of saw Israel in the sort of world system is that he described Palestine as the tip of Africa, right? Palestine being so close to Egypt, he described this as the tip of Africa. And he was a lifelong supporter of Palestinian rights, partly because Israel was a key supporter also of South Africa, right? A country that also had a system of apartheid, and which Israel, in fact, borrowed a system of apartheid from. So we also have to realize that Israel is an important part of the imperialist system that seeks to drain resources from the African continent, and its presence in that part of the world is to the detriment of African peoples globally.
Brother Amanda, clearly you are not exhibiting any signs of anxiety and fear. But I have to imagine that this executive order language that I am reading here, you know, which refers to terrorism and pro-jihadist Hamas sympathizers, I have to imagine that this type of language, the conflation with whatever legitimate peaceful protests you're involved in, and that kind of rhetoric, you know, that kind of being defined in such a manner must be sending a chill to your colleagues at Cornell. I see you have your cultural equipment in the background there. You're staying strong. You're ready for everything. But what about the other students? Some of them who have come from, you know, backgrounds where they weren't involved in sports and so on. Are they? What is the atmosphere like?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I'll be frank with you that I'm currently not living at my registered address. I had to move out of my home because of the threats.
Are you hiding out?
So it's quite this is quite a serious thing. I should be very clear. And the day after the executive order was passed, I was in my class. I was teaching a class on African American literature, and I received word on my phone that I got a text message that some immigration agents, black-clad, AR-15 rifles, you know, body armor, were in town in the city that I live in, Ithaca, and they were rounding up people. And there was a strong feeling that they could be coming for us. And I remember being in this class, looking at my phone, looking at my students, thinking, well, I have to finish the class. So as the students sort of, you know, spoke about their presentations, I was looking out the window from the third floor down at the street to see if there were any police that were coming for me. And I quickly arranged for a friend to pick me up. I ran downstairs once the class was finished. The door was open for me, ran into the car, and we drove away. And I haven't been back home, basically. I've been back, you know, for a few minutes to pick up stuff, but I haven't lived back at my home since then. And this is the case actually for other students as well. So this is, you know, this isn't a joke, despite my my seeming determination to carry on with this. We've had to make a lot of preparations, for the worst in terms of security, in terms of living, in terms of, what happens if one of us is taken? What do we do with our belongings, our phones? How do we handle, for example, a situation where we're in immigration detention, right? Who needs to be informed? How do we handle the media? There's a lot of things we've had to think about, actually. So it is actually quite concerning. My situation, as you mentioned, there are students who are in different situations. There's a student who's a Syrian national. There's a student who is a Canadian national. There's another British national. I'm Trinbagonian. My visa is in my Trinbagonian passport. I'm a Trinbagonian for this.
Instead of all this noise, you are Trinbagonian one day, some other day different island. It's Caribbean heritage. Well, let me ask an important question here. One of your colleagues, a brother by the name of a brother from the Gambia, I think it was, he became quite famous because they wanted to deport him prior to Trump's coming into office. So this deportation threat is something that we have to admit starts under the Biden administration. But one of your colleagues pointed out that the Jewish right-wing group Beitar, which was founded in the 1920s by one of the most militant founders of the Israeli state, a man called Jabotinsky, one of the most iconic Zionists of the 20th century, that this group Beitar had used AI to scrape social media and to make lists of the names of those they called Hamas supporters, those involved in these kinds of efforts on campuses. And that, and that was putting you guys under another degree of pressure. So it wasn't just the state, but civil society seemed to also be involved in the attempt to get you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a concerted effort by civil society, by lobby groups. You have groups such as AIPAC, which is a very influential pro-Israeli lobby group in Washington. You have individual Republicans. You have people at the university. Cornell University were the ones who drew up these lists in the first place, drawn from surveillance of CCTV footage, from sort of Wi-Fi geolocation sort of software. They've drawn up these lists of us and have all this information about us, which if the US government says, look, we're going to subpoena you and force you to hand over this information, they have the information ready to give to them, right? So, we're being tracked and looked at from various angles, from government through civil society and onwards. And I just wanted to bring you back to Beitar, this group. And you mentioned this guy, Jabotinsky. Now, one of the things that pro-Palestine protesters often get accused of is anti-Semitism in relation to a phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, the person who came up with that phrase is Jabotinsky, right? So this is the phrase used by arch-Zionists himself to basically justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, right? And that's being used against pro-Palestine protesters. And when pro-Palestine protesters talk about it, of course, they're not talking about throwing anyone into the sea, right? They're talking about having a state, a binational state, perhaps, that can incorporate all the different groups that now live in that part of the world. I just wanted to come back on that point. You mentioned Jabotinsky and his relationship with the group Beitar.
My colleague, Dr. Fergus. Dr. Fergus, is there anything you want to raise with Brother Amandla?
Yes, good evening, my brother.
Good evening.
It's nice to have you back again, although the circumstances rather iffy. From what you have said, we don't know what the news would be like about your situation tomorrow. Hopefully nothing comes out of your being on the show this evening. On a more personal level, could you clarify for us what your status is at the moment at Cornell University?
Sure.
I want to know also how much of the deportation policy goes beyond anti-American and anti-Israel statements, which of course is part of the reason, but not necessarily if you look at who are being deported, and therefore how much of it is more or equally anti-African, anti-non-white, how much of it is blatant racism rather than simply anti-American interest or perceived anti-American interest. And what are the prospects for your resumption of your normal duties at Cornell and, of course, the completion of your dissertation?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I should say that my suspension was lifted at the end of, the beginning of this year, end of last year, beginning of this year. So I was banned from campus for a period of time. Now, the thing is, I live on campus, so I effectively couldn't leave my house with any sort of comfort. Once I left my house, I had to try and find a way to get off campus. So I had a very sort of, I saw a home confinement situation. The suspension was lifted with some conditions. If you want to sort of compare Cornell have a sort of parallel legal system, and I struck a kind of plea bargain where there'll be a black mark on my record for a period of time, and if I don't break any more bylaws, then that mark will be expunged from my record. So I've more or less resumed normal student duties, except, of course, that I'm having to obviously manage this as well. And the university administration have not really offered any sort of clarity about what they're going to do, what stance they're going to take regarding students who could be facing deportation for this. I think you're correct to say that this is part of a wider sort of ethno-nationalism in the US. Trump, before he even took office, vowed to go after people who were undocumented across the country, right? And those raids have been taking place across the country, in New York, in places like Chicago, all over. And unfortunately for those people, they don't have the platform that I have to talk about this. So it's important that I also bring up those instances as well. I've even seen lists of Caribbean countries, Trinidad and Tobago. It'll be interesting to see the statistics of people being deported to Trinidad and Tobago. There was a case where Colombia was refusing to take in some of deportees, and then was threatened with sanctions, and then slowly, quickly sort of stood down. So there are a range of deportations taking place. Our potential deportation, I think is quite poignant, because it's using a sort of a First Amendment, which is the First Amendment is about freedom of expression, right? So Trump is basically saying that in our lawful exercise of speech, right, and political expression, he is trying to say that actually this is illegal and we're going to deport you on those grounds, right? So this is the difference between those who are undocumented and us, even though we have our documentation. That Trump is trying to use grounds which are speech which is protected by the US Constitution as grounds to then deport people. And when you start going down this sort of slippery slope, you then start getting into, okay, well, what can be legitimately said? What can universities say? Academic freedom. What can be taught at universities? We already know that there have been campaigns against, for example, Black studies, right? Certain books have been banned, from Toni Morrison to Ta-Nehisi Coates, have been banned in places in the south of the United States. So this is a part of a wider, what is being termed a war on woke campaign against a Black thought, progressive thought on campuses. One of the last things I wanted to just mention is one of the words that always comes up when we talk about repression of speech is McCarthyism. So this was a campaign after the Second World War, during the sort of rise of the Soviet Union, when the US government basically came down hard on those thinkers, those artists who were suspected of being sympathetic to leftist or Soviet or communist ideas. And we saw many Black people who were also caught up in this. So one of them was W.E.B. Du Bois, right? The famous thinker. The other was the singer Paul Robeson as well. So we also have to realize that it's often people who are racialized, who are marginalized, that are going to be the ones who speak up, because they're often the first to feel the weight of these oppressive policies in the first place. And by extension, those will be the ones who will often feel the brunt of the sort of arm of the law when it comes to trying to stamp out any sort of peaceful or legitimate activism against these policies.
Yeah, I have one more question. Hold on, Shabaka. I have one more question, but just as a side note, I just want to let you know that the African Diaspora History Studies at Cornell University was in fact started by our own Professor Fitzroy Batiste back in the early 1990s.
Right.
I remember he did a semester there, simply to introduce that study. So there's a legacy there for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to come back on your point, that the Department of Africana Studies at Cornell was the first department of Africana Studies in the US. So Africana Studies is the study of Africa and the diaspora. It's not just a study of the US, but it includes the Caribbean, it includes Africa, it includes the US and Canada and the entire Black world. Now, that department was founded in 1969 after students took part in occupations. They took part in activism. In fact, even you can see pictures of them with rifles slung over their shoulders, right? The university's response on that occasion was to sit down with the students, try and find a resolution, and they so decided to found this department, right? you can compare that to their response today at a peaceful protest, where they basically just suspended people and have not even tried to broker any sort of negotiation with them. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it goes to show that these institutions actually have a history, right? That they're not really adherent to anymore. And what's happening today is really sort of a glaring instance of them not learning from their own legacy.
Yeah. Okay. So my question is, I want you to make a link to the case, the South African case against Israel at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which was quite successful. And also the South African recently new law on land reclamation without compensation. And how perhaps that might have repercussions for the way that particularly Trump's most influential advisor, Elon Musk, might be looking at African people in general, a sort of retributive sort of policy, however it is implemented. Could you make that link for us? Because this is the intensification of the deportation of Africans in particular seemed to have occurred just at the time when Netanyahu visited Trump. There seems to be an escalation coming just around that time. Could you make that link? Yeah.
So I think one thing that unites South Africa, Israel, and the United States, that these are all settler colonial states. These are all states where Europeans settled and tried to exterminate or tried to subjugate the indigenous people in various ways, right? In South Africa, you had Bantustans under a system of apartheid. In Israel, you have a system of apartheid as well as an ongoing genocide. And in the United States, there is an ongoing genocide. I mean, we shouldn't talk about the destruction of Native Americans as being complete. They're still there. And there was still an ongoing genocide, which was coupled with racial slavery, right? And the repercussions of racial slavery we are still living with today, of course, right? So when Trump and Elon Musk and Netanyahu sit around the table, they're sitting around as three people who understand intimately. You have something very much in common beyond the fact that they're all white. They all belong to, they're all settlers. They're all effectively settlers, right? And there is a mentality among settlers. And I think Trump's early policies when it comes to South Africa, when it comes to Israel, is in itself a reflection of his own settler sympathies within the United States as well. You can't really divorce these things. There is, I think, in the case of South Africa, an attempt to roll back the discourse around race, right? Rather than view South Africans, this is a country where I think 6% of the population are white, but which owns 77% of the land, right? 77% of the land, right? Trump somehow has flipped that on its head to make it look as a black population, which who are the majority and own hardly any of the land, are the racists, right? We also see with Israel, the racial discourse has been flipped on its head, right? Israel just committed a genocide, yet it's those who oppose the genocide who are the racists, who are the anti-Semites, right? Okay, so this isn't just about trying to push policies that effectively allow aggressors and occupiers and settlers to gain more. This is also about trying to flip discourses that people like us have been working on in the making, exposing racism, exposing genocide, exposing settler colonialism. This is about flipping those discourses on the head to make it seem as though the West and its settler colonial allies are actually somehow in the moral, really have the moral high ground.
I think we can, in the midst of us, not to give you an opportunity to answer the charges that are coming against you, pro-Hamas global network. You're part of a pro-Hamas global network. You are a Hamas sympathizer and you are anti-Semitic. Those are the charges that are going to be thrown who have been through and are going to come up again if the state decides to pursue this matter and the university does not take a strong stand. How do you respond to these charges?
I absolutely reject those charges. Those charges are an attempt to smear what is peaceful protest against the wanton annihilation of a people. And if those people were black, if those people were Indian, if they were Chinese, if they were Jewish, we would also stand in the same way as we are standing today, right? So those are highly racialized language, Orientalist language, and those charges are designed to turn peaceful protest against the wanton annihilation of its people on its head and make it look like a crime. I refuse to accept those charges.
Well, I just heard a Jewish scholar on Mary Hassan's program saying that the way that the charge of anti-Semitism has been lobbed around, it has reached a point where you can't be a progressive if you haven't been accused of anti-Semitism. It's almost like a badge of honor. But I'd like you to give us a minute to sort of take apart the abuse of the term for our listening audience.
Yeah. So this term has been. Let's first be clear that anti-Semitism has been a massive problem historically, a problem in Europe, right? For hundreds of years. In Europe, right? Going back to the 13th century, the expulsion of Jews in the 13th century under Edward I in England. Cromwell brings them back again. There are numerous sort of spasms of violence against Jewish people in Europe. And that often is to do with their position as sort of religiously marginal to Christians and these sort of myths of them being responsible for killing Christ, effectively, right? But also their sort of marginal social status within European societies, right? Both insiders and outsiders as well, right? So anti-Semitism is a profoundly European problem, right? We see this into the 19th and 20th centuries. We see Russia, pogroms against Jewish people in Russia, right? And these pogroms lead to many Jews leaving Russia and sort of what is today Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and moving to the West, to the United States, to Britain and other Western European countries, right? We then have the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust against Jewish people, which takes place, right? And, of course, these are horrible, horrible incidents, but this does not in any way justify what then takes place, the dispossession of people, not in Europe, in Palestine. These are two different things. We know that Jewish refugees.
I think, Amanda, just to make a quick comment there, what is particularly tragic for me about the state of the Palestinians currently is the fact that Muslims under Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula, Muslims maintained an accommodation with Jews, and it wasn't until the Muslims were overthrown that we had these pogroms against the Jews. And of course, in Palestine, historically, we've had Muslims, Christians, and Jews living alongside each other.
Exactly. No, precisely. The period of Muslim rule in Spain was the Jewish Golden Age happened under Muslim rule in Spain, right? Some of the greatest poetry, thinkers, philosophers of Judaism were rooted in Muslim Spain, right? So this is something which is a fact. I think what's happened is that this word has become the interests of the Jewish people have now been allied to the interests of Israel. And I think this is a very dangerous position, not for those of us who are active and trying to, protest against Israel, but actually for the Jewish people themselves, right? Because now the fate of their religion, the fate of their people has now been tied to the fate of what is actually a very mendacious, an expansionist, a colonial nation state. Judaism has beautiful values. It's been around for thousands of years. It really is a shame for it to now be allied tragically to this nation state of Israel, which has just committed a genocide. I mean, I don't know how that would make someone feel, honestly.
Well, brother, we want to take this opportunity to wish you all the best in your ongoing struggle there in the United States. We're going to continue to monitor it from here in Trinidad, and Of course, we also stand ready to act in solidarity with you and other Caribbean students who might face some kind of prejudice as a result of this executive order. So, on behalf of the Emancipation Support Committee and Caribbean Freedom Project, we send our solidarity to you, and of course, please share it with the other students under the same sort of challenge, facing the same challenges. I want to thank you again for being with us, for joining us tonight on Indaba, another episode of this program, The Place Where Knowledge Grows. And Dr. Fergus and yourself, I read the closing remarks to both of you to sign off on tonight's show.
I'll give Amanda final word.
Yeah.
Well, as Shabaka said, we can only wish you the best. We wish you personal safety and success in pulling through this challenging moment. So with that, I hand over to you to make your closing remarks.
And of course, we salute your courage, brother, for speaking out boldly at this in this perilous time.
Thank you very much for having me. And I think it's important to recognize the importance of a conflict that takes place on the other side of the world. It's important to our well-being here in the Caribbean as well. That when imperialism unleashes violence against one, we also have to defend ourselves and realize that it could be unleashed against us as well. So I hope we're following events over there and also trying to raise awareness within our own communities about what is taking place, because even though it's over there, it is also over here as well. It is one and the same in reality. Thank you.
Yes, on that note, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Good night, brothers and sisters. This has been another edition of Indaba, and we invite you, of course, to join us next week, same time, same place, for the next episode. Good night, Doctor.
Good night, my brother. See you next week.